The US military needed a lightweight, reliable motorcycle for various purposes during World War II. Harley-Davidson, like other American motorcycle manufacturers, was tasked with producing such a motorcycle. From He Who Was There. Milton J. Long, Lieutenant Colonel, USA, retired, was there. In his own words, Long says, "When World War II came along, the older ones were the first to go, but by 1942, almost all of the gang went, except for the few of us that were still in school. There was no doubt that after graduation in 1942, we would be going into the service." I had met John Harley in 1941 when he visited Wooster, Ohio at the Harley shop. He was out trying to find people that wanted to ride bikes in the Army, if they had to go. He told us to enlist in the armored forces and to let him know where we were. This I did, and upon graduation, I enlisted. I didn't have to report until October 3rd, so I had all summer to get ready. I contacted John Harley at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Motorcycle training in the Army was very interesting. Our first visit to the motor pool would include an introduction to Army bikes. They told what type of service the rider would take care of and what would be done by others. They went over the motorcycle and told us of its working parts. They had an oil bath air filter because of the dusty and dirty conditions they must operate in. The class was divided into two parts. One for soldiers that had driven bikes in civilian life and those that had never had anything to do with them. In my group, we only had 5 that had driven motorcycles before. They took the beginners aside and gave them each a bike. The instructor went through how to start the engine and how the controls worked. Those of us that had experience with motorcycles were used as coaches to help them. They started by having them ride a short distance in low gear. Then they advanced to getting them to ride a short distance and shifting gears. Once they mastered that, they were ready to try it on the road. They played follow the leaders around the motor pool. Some had problems, but soon go to where they could follow without running into each other. The motorcycles we were using were Harley-Davidson WLAs that had seen a lot of service. None had any headlights because they got knocked off. The motors were so loose that you couldn't tell when they were on the compression cycle or not, so you just had to keep kicking them over until they started. The next phase was to take them cross-country and see how the riders did missing trees and bushes. After a few days of this, we went to the motorcycle driving course. They made those of us that had driving motorcycles in civilian life drive the course first while the beginners watched. It was a tough course and all of us flopped several times. It had almost every condition you would find in cross-country driving, including a large area of fresh mud at the end. They would bring a water truck out from post every day and wet it down. This proved to be tough to get through, but we made it. The new drivers were taken one at a time through the course, and the instructor would show how each section should be driven. Then, the students would try it. They could not advance to the next section until they passed the first one. As the class got split up, we would take a small group to the next section and proceeded accordingly. Needless to say, it took several weeks to get the beginners through the entire course. One thing sure was that the ones that lived to complete the course would know how to ride motorcycles. Some would drop out for whatever reason. When the instructors were satisfied that I knew how to ride a motorcycle, they placed us with other groups and gave us a good Harley, complete with a headlight. These were WLAs of the new style. It was a pleasure to drive them because they had a lot more power and would go in a straight line. Lieutenant John Harley entered the picture about this time, bringing with him one of the new Harley-Davidson XAs. Boy, they were really nice. He had us go to the main post-armored force school where we were introduced to the new bike. The instructors were civilians from the factory. They explained we would be testing the new bike to find if anything could break. We took them on the road for a few days playing follow the leader. Every night when we turned them in, the factory people would check them all over. This went on for a while, then they wanted to test them under field conditions. We started driving cross-country through rough ground and under bad conditions. They were really good. We really liked the foot shift and hand clutch. The first problem we had was catching the cylinder on stumps and rocks. Several broke the cylinder off. The second thing was when you flop on this bike, it wanted to turn upside down. They started working on sill bars to correct this problem. The bike through mud and sand, and this was great. You couldn't do that with the WLAs. We had a few that the rear gearbox broke, and this was usually when we had to run long distances in a low gear. Low gear was low enough that you could walk beside. The next phase of testing would be convoy duty. This was a real test of man and machine. We started to convoy M5 light tanks at night over very dusty roads. They would drop us off at a road crossing, and when the last tank had passed, it was followed by a maintenance truck. We had to lap the convoy and get back up front to be used at another road crossing. When you're trying to get by 25 light tanks that are raising a lot of dust, it is tough. They are about 35 yards apart, driving with just blackout lights and often having trouble seeing the tank in front of them due to the dust. Makes for interesting duty. These roads are one lane, so sometimes you had to go up on the bank to get past them. One night I was working my way forward when I jumped in between two tanks, waiting for a chance to pass. Well, I thought his right blackout light was the left one, and when I gunned my bike to go around, I ran into the left track. It threw my front wheel up in the air, and the bike went over my right shoulder and landed in front of the next tank. I could do nothing but roll into a ditch to keep from being run over myself. That tank ran over my brand new XA, and the 10 tanks that came next followed suit. When the maintenance truck came into view, I flagged them down and we dug my bike out of the dirt. It was completely flat and about 6 inches thick. We hung it on the hook and followed the convoy back to camp. We decided to lean the flat bike against the motor officer's shed. The next morning, I had to sign a bunch of papers and make an accident report. I think the Harley people took that bike back to Milwaukee as a display item. Near the end of the training period, we were taken to a spot where they would teach us how to react when fired upon. The bikes were armed with a Thompson machine gun on the right side of the front fork, and the box on the left side contained 2 XX drums of 45 cal ammo. The demonstration was to show that if you were out as a point of a scouting mission and are fired on, you would slow the bike down, hit the foot brake, and flop the bike on its left side. Using the bike as a shield, you would grab the Tommy gun from the scabbard on the front fork, load a drum of ammo from the left side of the fork, and return the enemy's fire, all while lying on your stomach behind the motorcycle. After we had all done this, we were taken to a live fire area and taught how this would work in combat. Once the point man had been fired upon, he would take the action as described above. The other motorcycles would proceed to form a firing line on him. He would be firing at the enemy while this was taking place. Once all of the bikes were in firing position, they would put up targets on the hill, and we would engage them with machine gun fire. You would be scored on how long it took you to engage the enemy and how many targets you hit. Of the 50 bikes involved in our first live fire exercise, 10 were damaged so badly that they could not be driven. Some had bent handlebars and several drivers had broken ankles and fingers. The bikes that made it we driven back to camp, while the remainder were tied to the hook on the maintenance truck for the trip back. I remember one XA had a broken jug. The problem of the XA wanting to turn upside down was never solved. The rider just had to be ready for it and do the best he could. By early 1943, the only people using motorcycles were the military police. They started using the Jeeps in the winter of 1944 and found them to be much better than motorcycles when the roads were bad. President Franklin D. Roosevelt visited Fort Knox in April 1943. They wanted a motorcycle escort, so they picked several of us that had driven the new XAs for that special duty. He viewed a firepower show that really impressed him. The motorcycles were shown at the end, and when they came up to the display area, they slid to a stop and fired their Tommy guns as we had been trained. Later, the president met some of us at the officers' club. When I shook his hand, he asked me if I was one of the motorcycle escorts, to which I proudly said, "Yes, sir." I will never forget that moment. Lieutenant Harley told us that the school was still very busy training soldiers to repair motorcycles, and some foreign students were present due to our selling Harleys to their countries. We wanted more time to play with the XA and the Indian 841, but that wasn't in the cards. I was sorry to see the Army motorcycle was being replaced by the Jeep, but I had enough bruises and I had eaten enough dust riding bikes to last a lifetime. Lieutenant Colonel Milton J. Long, U.S. Army, retired. Thanks for watching! Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more iconic stories. Looks like there's a curve up ahead. I wonder what we'll find around the bend.